Hey y'all, welcome back. I'm Greg Brownderville. Today I want to talk about another forgotten holiday. Y'all know that I'm really interested in these forgotten holidays and I like to celebrate them. This fall I celebrated Michaelmas, a forgotten autumnal holiday. I celebrated it on September 29th. That's where it appears on the Western liturgical calendar of Christianity. That's the Gregorian calendar version. That's the calendar we're using now in this era. In previous eras, we used in the West the Julian calendar, and on the Julian calendar, Michaelmas would be on October 10th, or some people say October 11th. And Eastern Christian churches will celebrate Michaelmas on November 8th. So we're still in the Michaelmas season, so you could still celebrate it. You can kind of celebrate it whenever you want to. I just chose September 29th because that's the traditional day. So what is Michaelmas about? Well, Michaelmas means Michael's Mass, basically. So this is a day that is dedicated to the Archangel Michael. In the Anglican Church, this day is called the Feast of St. Michael and All Angels. In the same way that Christ's Mass becomes Christmas, Michael's Mass becomes Michaelmas. And because it falls near the autumn equinox, it is linked with the opening of autumn and the shortening of days. Who is Archangel Michael? Well, there's not a lot about him in the Bible. I think there are something like 7 verses that mention him by name. That may not be exactly right, but it's something like that. There aren't many verses. He is the captain of the heavenly host, that is the commander of God's heavenly army. And when the rebellious angels fought against God, Michael was the captain of God's army that defeated Satan and the other fallen angels and kicked them out of heaven. The Archangel Michael was very popular in the Middle Ages in Britain, and there were hundreds, I think, of early churches dedicated to him. It's interesting how people view the Archangel Michael today. Jehovah's Witnesses will sometimes think of the Archangel Michael as the pre-incarnate Christ. So that makes Michael an extremely important figure in the view of Jehovah's Witnesses. This is considered a heresy, I think, by most Christians, but that's the belief amongst Jehovah's Witnesses. There's some interesting kind of folklore around this figure of the Archangel Michael, and he's pretty important in occult circles. For example, on Lake Louise in Alberta, Banff, Alberta, Canada, there's a vortex called Archangel Michael's Vortex, and people go there in hopes of feeling the presence of the Archangel Michael. Most people don't, even though Michaelmas is still on the Feast of St. Michael and All Angels, for example, is still on the liturgical calendar in Anglican and Episcopal churches, Michaelmas is not celebrated in the home that much anymore in Britain or in the United States. But it was once a very, very important holiday, just a beloved holiday. And one thing that is associated with Michaelmas, a feature of the holiday when it was celebrated in the homes, was that people would eat a roast goose, sometimes called an embling. And this eating of the roast goose was a stronger custom than modern Easter eggs or the Christmas turkey combined. It was really a strong custom in Britain and Ireland. Also, on Michaelmas Eve, the night before Michaelmas, or on the in some areas on the Sunday before Michaelmas, folks would crack nuts. That was a part of the Michaelmas tradition. And For example, in the Kingston upon Thames Church in Surrey, they would do this in church on the Sunday during service, the Sunday before Michaelmas, and people of all ages would participate. And sometimes the cracking of the nuts would be so loud that the priest or the father, whoever was talking, would have to wait until all the nut cracking died down, because it was so noisy, and he couldn't really go forward with the homily. Sometimes people would gather Michaelmas daisies or asters and arrange them in a posy on the Michaelmas table, on the table where folks would be feasting on roast goose. That was part of the tradition in Britain. And there's kind of a fun aspect of this holiday that has to do with blackberries. So the folklore in Britain held that when Archangel Michael kicked Satan out of heaven, Satan fell through the sky. When I think of this, I like to think of John Milton's wonderful description of, was it Mulciber's descent from heaven, sheer or the crystal battlements, and he falls like all day into the evening. Those of you who know your Milton will know what I'm talking about. I like to think of that in connection with this idea of Satan's fall. But what the folklore in Britain says is that when Satan fell, he landed on earth in a patch of blackberry brambles. And those of you who've ever been around blackberries know that they're very thorny. The brambles are very thorny. And so the devil landed in this thorny blackberry bush and was mad. And so he defiled the blackberries in some way. And you get differing accounts of exactly how he defiled them. But in some of the accounts, it can get pretty nasty. Steve Roud, a famous folklorist in Britain, said, in the polite versions of this superstition, the devil puts his foot on the berries or wipes his club or tail over them. But in more graphic versions, he defiles them in more earthy ways. Well, the result of this folklore, or I don't know which came first, the feeling about blackberries or the folklore, but hand in hand with this folklore is the idea that you should not eat blackberries after Michaelmas because the devil has defiled them. And this may be related to the fact that in Britain, blackberries would build up a lot of tannic acid after Michaelmas anyway, and so they were not as good. I don't know, but that's one hypothesis about this. So sometimes people will have blackberries on the Michaelmas table because it's your last chance to enjoy them before the devil defiles them. And I read in Steve Roud's, one of his books, that one time these two guys were walking around in the country in Britain, and one of them reached to pick some blackberries, and the other one said, "Don't do that." And he said, Why not? And the other guy said, because it's after Michaelmas and the devil's been at him. So, and this superstition has persisted a long time, and I think it's still known as kind of a sort of comical country superstition in Britain. I don't know how many people actually believe it. I'd like to know. So if you're out there and you still hold to this, please let me know, because I have a deep respect for people who have that kind of intimate relationship with folklore that no longer has that kind of spell over most people. I kind of admire people who can still feel the folklore deeply. Okay. So what else do you eat for your Michaelmas feast? One thing that people like to have is roast potatoes. And some people do those wonderful triple cooked chips that the British prepare sometimes. My favorite French fry-like food, it's not exactly like an American French fry. It's chunkier. And sometimes on British menus, you'll see chunky chips and French fries, and you know the chunky chips are the British ones. And sometimes you'll see triple cooked chips, and those are the great ones, because you cut the potatoes up in kind of large chunks, it's kind of chunky pieces, and then you boil them until they're about to break up and turn into potato soup, but you take them off the heat right before that happens, and kind of give the chips a shake in a colander, and this will break up the the potatoes a little bit. There will be like a little bit of kind of broken upness on the outside of the chips. That's really important. And then you set them aside for a little bit, then put them in some oil, some kind of fat, and fry them a little bit until they're kind of getting golden. Take them off the heat again, let them sit for a while, then put them back on the heat one more time, and they'll get good and crisp. And if you do it just right, what you'll have is a really crispy outside of the chip, and the inside will be, not exactly like mashed potatoes, but very soft. And it's just delicious. I think it's the best version of that type of potato, like a fried potato. And so what people do at Michaelmas is they render the fat off the goose. And goose fat is rich and wonderful. And then you use that goose fat to triple cook your chips. And so that's what I did this year. And those triple cooked chips with goose fat were amazing. I will definitely be doing this again. And I did my goose with like a lot of lemon and some apple and rosemary. I think if I do it again around Christmas time, as I'm planning to do, I'll use Christmas spices. A lot of people recommend that for goose. And now that I've had the goose, I can see why that would be great, because goose meat, it reminds me of the duck I ate growing up here in the States. But goose, perhaps even more than duck, is like a midway point between what I think of as poultry and beef. In some ways reminded me of beef, and I think that really wonderful flavor of the goose meat will stand up to the Christmas spices. And so I'm looking forward to trying that, maybe with some honey, Christmas spices and honey, baste the bird that way. I was very grateful to Central Market in Dallas, Texas, who hooked me up with the goose, because I didn't know if I'd be able to find one in time for Michaelmas, but I was, thanks to Central Market. Joanna Bogle, in her book, A Book of Feasts and Seasons, offers up a harvest grace that can be said at the table. And the harvest grace that she offers goes, back of the bread is the flour, back of the flour is the mill, back of the mill is the wind and the rain, and the Father's will. Some people think that one reason Michaelmas is not as popular, and really never was as popular in the States as it had been in Britain, is because the American Thanksgiving competes with it. And there's probably some truth to that. Although Michaelmas died out in Britain too, so I don't know that we can really attribute it to the popularity of the American Thanksgiving. But, it wouldn't hurt to have two Thanksgiving-like holidays in the fall. I'm one for wanting more holidays rather than fewer. And, Michaelmas comes a little bit earlier than Thanksgiving. So it's a nice holiday to celebrate. It's right at the beginning of fall. And so you can really think of yourself as celebrating the opening of fall. And that's the way we thought of it this year, my friends and I, when we were celebrating it. I got to thinking about these angels, these archangels in Christian mythology, Christian scripture, Christian lore, Christian belief, and how mysterious they are. Again, as I was saying before, we don't know a ton about the archangels. Scripture doesn't tell us a lot, and they're very important figures and mysterious figures, and I'm drawn to that idea of mysterious presences, mysterious forces about which we don't know all that much. I have a poem in my book, Gus, called Mystery, that says everything that matters is a mystery. And I'm really a fan of holidays and rituals that involve embracing mystery. I always got frustrated when I heard preachers that I was exposed to in college saying things like the Bible is a manual for living. That was like a trope. Like that, I heard that multiple times, manual for living. And I thought, manual? We're talking about a book that is deeply poetic and full of poetry, full of great stories. It's not a manual. And that tendency to want to flatten out a piece of scripture into a YouTube video about how to tie a tie or something, just a how-to guide, like a how-to book, really bothered me. And so I'm a fan of embracing mystery and the richness of it. And you can think of these mysterious figures of the archangels as embodiments, personifications of that idea of mysterious presence, mysterious forces that act on our lives. A couple of other things. I'll come back and show how you could weave this into a Michaelmas celebration, but I want to touch on some other points. One thing that Michaelmas was traditionally in Britain is a time when you would have to pay up. So it was a day when like rent payments came due, for example. People thought of it as a time to settle debts, pay up. And so in that way, it is associated with law and regularity, a kind of schedule, the structures that organize our lives, and what those structures demand of us. But also, it was a time when new leaders would be elected locally, like in villages. For example, like the bailiff-elect would be presented sometimes on Michaelmas. And there was this curious belief in Britain that there was something called the lawless hour. And the idea was that there was this hour during which the old local leaders were no longer in power, but the new local leaders hadn't really assumed, but they hadn't really asserted power yet. They hadn't really been granted power yet. And so no one was leading, no one was in charge. And so anything goes during the lawless hour. That was the idea. So the old leaders, they're gone. They're no longer in power. The new leaders aren't in power yet. And so there's this lawless hour. And this would be celebrated quite colorfully in certain villages. Sometimes the bailiff-elect would be paraded through town, and folks would pelt the new leader with apples. And sometimes this would be at people's homes. And I read somewhere that one eyewitness to this said, I've seen as many as 40 pots of apples thrown at one house. I mean, it sounds dangerous for the new local leaders to get pelted with that many apples. And sometimes people would have sort of battles with each other, throwing various kinds of stalks from the crops at each other, that kind of thing. And so the lawless hour makes you think of the opposite of structure. It's a time of anything goes. And so on the one hand, we associate Michaelmas with paying up, the rules, the law, structure. This is how things work. But on the other hand, because of the lawless hour, it's associated with unruliness, anything goes, mayhem, pandemonium. So there's this paradox then, and I've reflected on this when I was celebrating Michaelmas, this wonderful paradox between structure and absolute wantonness, unruliness, freedom. And this made me think about poetry. I'm a poet, and so I often think of things through the lens of writing poems. And I thought, when you're writing in a form, like say the sonnet form, you do have rules, but within that structure, within those parameters, you can sometimes achieve something that feels like absolute freedom. Maybe there's a line that just feels like it's doing whatever it wants, as if there were no rules, even though it is actually still playing by the rules. There's a kind of paradoxical feeling you can have. I was just listening to a wonderful lecture by the Miltonist John Rogers about Milton's epic poem, Paradise Lost. And John Rogers made the great point that the very first line of the epic poem, of man's first disobedience and the fruit, you start out with an iamb, and this is supposed to be an iambic pentameter. And a perfectly regular line of iambic pentameter would be like dun 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 dun. And we start out with an iamb, of man's, but then in the second foot, which is a delicate foot in a line of iambic pentameter, if you mess around that second foot, you can get some real destabilization of the line. And Milton does just that. He varies the second foot rhythmically. So he says, of man's first, you have to stress the word first. Well, if it were an I am, it would be unstressed. But he stresses it of man's first disobedience and the fruit. So the word first is the first metrical disobedience in the line and in the poem. And if you just read that line of man's first disobedience and the fruit, it doesn't even sound like a line that's paying attention to meter, and yet it will scan. The metrical substitutions that Milton's using are known variations that are available to a poet who's using iambic pentameter. So it's both abiding by the structure and seeming to be free of the structure. And this is the kind of thing you can experience on Michaelmas. You can reflect on this and how in life itself, outside of poems, life can be like a poem, because within the structures of our lives, within the things that hem us in and make us feel trapped or stifled or sort of bereft of the kind of limitless possibility we might hope for, we can have moments that feel like gifts of possibility. Even though you're in a life that hems you in certain ways, you can have moments in which you feel that absolutely anything is possible for you, that limitless possibilities available to you. There is that paradox we experience in life of structure and limitless possibility. These are subjective. I mean, the structure is not subjective. Sometimes it just is. It's there. But that feeling that anything can happen, it may not be absolutely true because we do have limitations, but the fact that we can feel that way in certain moments is important. And I'm interested in that paradox between structure and freedom. And so I thought about that in connection with Michaelmas because of its being a day of paying your rents, for example, and a day of the lawless hour. So this is something I wanted to work into my celebration of Michaelmas. And so here's what I recommend as a way to celebrate these things we've been talking about on Michaelmas. Perhaps you could write a grace, a harvest grace. I mentioned the one earlier and read it to you that I got from Joanna Bogle's book. The back of the bread is the flour, back of the flour is the mill, back of the mill is the wind and the rain and the Father's will. Well, I could imagine writing a much longer harvest grace that would be it would be customized for you. And you could look back over your year in preparation for Michaelmas, in the days leading up to Michaelmas. You could look back over the year and ask yourself, were there moments when you felt that unseen hands were guiding your life and creating magical moments that gave you what you needed? It might be structure. Some people are looking for structure because their lives are so chaotic, and structure feels like the gift. If that's you, you could think about those moments. Were there moments when unseen hands, mysterious presences, or forces seemed to provide that structure you needed? Then you could give thanks for that in your harvest grace. That you could, and this could be when you say grace before partaking of the Michaelmas goose and the triple cooked chips, you could mention those moments when these unseen hands provided you the structure you needed. Or maybe your life is one that has too much structure, and what you needed was a sense of freedom. You wanted moments when you felt that life could wrangle itself free from these stifling forms or parameters or structures and give you something different, give you a feeling of possibility, maybe of adventure. And if that's what you needed, look back over your year and ask yourself, were there moments when it felt that unseen hands provided that for you? Even if it was just a moment, maybe it's a flicker of a feeling of possibility. That's something to be grateful for. You could give thanks for that in your harvest grace that you would say before partaking of the Michaelmas goose. So I would recommend writing out a harvest grace in advance of Michaelmas Day, in those days leading up, maybe the week before. And think of these things that I've mentioned. Write out a harvest grace for yourself. And if you have friends over or family, maybe you could write this thing communally, and it could mention things that touch on events and circumstances, kind of gifted moments in the lives of everyone in the family or the friend group. Or each person could write a harvest grace individually, and they could all be read before partaking of the Michaelmas goose. Whatever works for you. But I think that would be a beautiful tradition you could start, and a way of celebrating Michaelmas. And I definitely recommend trying the Michaelmas goose. It was really delicious and a lot of fun to cook. I mean, I watched a bunch of YouTube videos and read some books about how to cook goose. I'd never even eaten goose, much less cooked one. So I had to learn all that, just, starting from nothing, zero knowledge this year. And it was a ton of fun. So you could do the goose, the roast potatoes. I recommend the triple cooked chips. And you can find some really nice videos online on YouTube for how to do triple cooked chips. British style, just use goose fat. They probably won't mention goose fat, but you can use the goose fat that you render off the goose to do your triple cooked chips. And say a Michaelmas grace, a harvest grace. And for me, in my mind, this would be a wonderful tradition to start if you're interested in celebrating Michaelmas. I had a great time celebrating it this year, and I just wanted to pass it along in case anybody else is interested in this forgotten holiday. Thank y'all for watching.